It's my responsibility to try and keep you awake for the next 40 minutes or so, and that's going to be a challenge. I have entitled this Assessing and Addressing Cyber Threats because what I want to do today is to try and bring together some of the glue that's necessary to give a broader understanding of what we've been talking about today. There have been a lot of, can you hear me at the back when I walk away from the microphone? Can you get me the mic? To try and just assess to a greater extent the threats that are out there. And what I want to do is to, I'm just going to put this on, thank you very much.
Cyber espionage.
Cyber attack.
Someone's listening.
Sorry about the delay here. I'm on. Am I on? Can you hear me now? Okay, so what I want to do is to try and start with an overview of where the attacks are coming from in the sense of the generality of attacks, not the specificity of it. Then to talk about how to evaluate the risk dynamics of this, because I think risk is an important part of feeding in towards your defense strategy, because you've got to make decisions, you've got to make playoffs in relation to how to evaluate what best to do for your business, and then ultimately to put in play the business, because it was touched upon this morning that the role of the business is to be your supporter, but they can also be your greatest critic, and in that sense to see where you can develop your own sense of modelling from. To do that, I want to cover briefly about 9 separate areas. I want to talk briefly on the economic background and then run that through the threats, the near misses, the losses, the risk appetite, all of which are currencies of risk as I define them, then touching on responsibilities, then touching briefly on insiders, third-party providers, and ultimately then on scenarios. So I've a lot to cover. I need to move quickly on it. The relevance of the background to me is that a lot has changed in the world in the last couple of years as a consequence of the economic crisis. And the result of that is that there's huge economic pressure on those who provide IT, because business volumes have fallen, and as a consequence of that, businesses are putting you under pressure to cut costs. Now that has the danger of cutting corners, because if you take, for example, your DDoS, if you haven't had a DDoS attack, the natural question is, well, why would we want to waste money in trying to prevent one happening or insuring against one? That doesn't apply to your fire insurance policy. People accept that that's a natural risk, and even though you haven't had a fire, they still let you have a fire insurance policy. So already IT is on the back foot in terms of trying to justify some spend here. The next area tends to be capital expenditure, where the challenge is again, well, do you want more money? Because sure, aren't you one of the biggest cost centers anyway? IT is the hub which rotates, or around which the business rotates. So inevitably you're under a challenge with that. So the economics are at one level pressing you. At another level, looking to the outside projection of the business model, everyone knows that going to the World Wide Web, providing internet access for your customers, wireless access, converged devices, this all drives down the economics of doing business. So they want more of your services as part of the solution to the economic crisis. They're also driving at you the idea that, yes, we can do more of this, but maybe we'll do that by a third party. So we'll outsource, or we'll partnership or joint venture. So again, the cost pressures are coming to bear in those environments. Gravitating all around this is, of course, the expansion of the IT world generally, because what we're seeing is that countries like India, China, Africa are joining the web in a major way, and in doing so, these are economies where, quite frankly, the economics locally is driven by a bowl of rice a day. Many of these economies, people make very little, so the potential to start to use technology as an attack into the Western economies is something which gives them a tremendous opportunity to realize value for themselves. And what we've been seeing in the last number of years has been English language speaking attacks coming out of China, showing that they're not only learning their languages, but they're now also attacking on the basis of that. And the other dynamic which is at play here is, in my opinion, there has never been so much data stored ever. There's a massive amount of data stored, and again, the economics is driving towards consolidation of data and databases. So again, you're putting huge honeypots in front of people who have access, which will eventually become your weak point as people start to hack into this and realize the value that comes from data. The suggested minimum standard I'm giving you there is that you need to know the risk you face on a daily basis as a consequence of activities outside of your control that have the ability to impact activities within your control. We just reflect on that for a moment. The challenge is to know what's out there that's coming at you. And the way to address that my place to start is with threats. Threats I see as one of the four currencies of what we have to deal with here. I'm defining a threat as an issue which has the potential to disrupt your business before you assess it. Once you assess it, it stops being a threat because you've actively analysed it and you've recognised whether or not you're going to respond to it or whether or not it's of little consequence to you. So up to the point of cognizance, you still have something which is out there. It could be a physical feature, it could be the potential for a flash flood. But in the cyber world, we know that the number and the variety and the type of threats which are out there are many and varied. And the first point of reference I believe you've got to make is an understanding of the sort of threats that have the ability to impact your business model, because that's your understanding of how what's out there can come towards you. And when you look at threats, the inevitable response of the business is they're not interested. This is your problem. This is not a business problem. This is something which is out there. And so don't bother the business with this sort of stuff because they frankly haven't much of an interest. The reality, of course, as I'm stating it there, is that until you internalize those threats, you still have that open risk. Now, are you going to disclose that on a risk register? Or are you simply going to feign ignorance and say, yeah, okay, if I don't pretend not to know about it, well then, sure, it doesn't exist in my mind, so I don't have therefore to worry about it. Threats then is the first baseline I think you've got to make a decision upon. Near misses, and I don't mean the next door neighbour, near misses come in two flavours to me. The first is the misfortunes of others, and we've seen a lot of that today in relation to people like Sony or TK Maxx or whoever. These are other corporations, businesses that are having difficulties. And what you can do is learn from their difficulties without having to experience it firsthand. To do that, you've got to actively analyse again what's happening out there. You've got to take it on board and actually process it so that you have a deeper understanding of what went wrong, which is why a lot of us tend to ask the question, what happened in Sony's case? Could it happen to us? Could our business model be impacted? And some of this can be done on a sectoral basis, because often you will find that attacks are mounted on a sectoral basis. For example, earlier we discussed the financial services industry and the fact that every online bank just about on the planet is in somebody's attack radar. So be conscious of that. The other piece, the luck of the draw, tends to come from situations where you were just about to launch some brand new product or new code, and you discovered there was something wrong in that code, and you know yourself that at that moment you said, wow, that could have happened to us. The important point for all of this from a risk perspective is that you actually report it and actively see that that fills your deeper understanding of the risk environment that you're working into. Because I'll join all this together later when I do a compendium of this to give you a deeper connection to what I'm driving at. But again, the business's attitude in the bottom box there is, it's not our problem, we don't want to know, we're not interested. Where they get interested is when we have actual real losses. When somebody is out the money, the question tends to be, who's going to divvy up for this? Who's going to pay for this? So if you're 15,000 out, does anybody really care? No, we can lose that somewhere in the budgets. We can override that. We can just forget about that. But if you're 15 million out, who now wants to put their hand up and own up? What now is the business's attitude to saying, we have a problem, Houston. So this is where I think the thing becomes reflective, because it then becomes an exercise in blame attribution. And when defenses fail, the business ultimately ends up paying the price. But that price is a different price than simply the money. Because losses, when you analyse them, if you take first off the money losses, there are maybe 6 different types of money losses that I have indicated there. The first is the direct loss. We're actually out the money. We've lost some money somewhere. It's gone missing, and that's just pure tangible loss. The second is the indirect, where the consequence of your processing or not processing meant that somewhere in the chain of process, somebody else lost out, and you ultimately have to recompense them for your failure in that situation. Third tends to be consequential loss. Let's say, for example, that I'm providing stock quotes for an online trading site, and I provide the wrong quotes. The customer who makes the decision based upon my false information and suffers the loss will sue me, and consequentially I will be bound to pay on that loss because I have been the originator of the fault. Next, restitution. Restitution, I find, is one of these things that is a simple word, but it can be an incredibly complex and expensive thing to do. I quote you the example of the Nationwide Building Society in the United Kingdom, who lost a laptop. It was stolen, one laptop stolen. Consequent of that, the regulator said, Was it encrypted? No, it wasn't. Okay, well then, do you know which customer information was on that laptop? No, we don't. Well, that means then you're going to have to write to each of your customers, all 11 million of them. Now, writing to 11 million customers in itself is a costly exercise. The steward's inquiry that goes on after it, with consultants and all sorts, is another costly exercise. Putting people back in the position they should have been in the first place is costly exercises. Most of your businesses are like Formula One racing cars. They are not designed to go backwards. They're designed to go forward remorselessly and efficiently, but they're very hard to reverse up. It's very difficult to find that point when the thing went wrong, particularly if it's something like data corruption. When does data corruption start? Can you actually find that moment? Very difficult in those situations. The repair bill, the bill to actually fix the fault, well, ultimately you'll have to bear that. It may be damage to your servers, your networks, who knows what. But again, there's an expense in that. And then the ability to ensure that you can never again repeat this mistake. We saw figures earlier for Sony in relation to how much money they had to spend, or will be spending on their accounts. The figures for TK Maxx when they lost their 45 million records. They provisioned $120 million US as a consequence of that loss. So again, what I'm saying is that the actual implication between the spending and the saving is very disproportionate, because when you have to start rectification, it becomes a very expensive business. So let me then try and summarize what I've talked about over the first couple of slides here in the currency of losses. What I'm saying is that out there, as we've discussed a lot of today, there is a big universe of threats. The attack vectors are coming at you in this direction. And what you're trying to do at the first pass is to identify the predictable hits. What is it that's likely to impact you from the universe of threats which is out there? Second, looking to the near misses and the misfortunes of others. Again, you should be able to define and reduce that threat universe to a better understanding of what becomes or could become avoidable losses by recognizing what others have impacted or been impacted by, which you can then yourself avoid as a consequence of better navigation, better defense, and better protection. Losses themselves can, do, and will happen. And that reflects the fact that cybercrime isn't one of those when moments. It's a matter of if or when, and the inevitability is that it is going to actually impact you. So what you're defining all the way along here ultimately becomes your risk appetite. And let me just pause on that for a moment, because as a consequence of the crisis that there has been, there is a much greater focus now upon the veracity of financial reporting, that is to say your annual accounts, etc. But running alongside that now has been the emergence of risk committees. That is to say, bodies of people working towards the board who are deciding upon how much risk appetite your business is prepared to run and they're prepared to underwrite. So taking that a step further, there's also pressure now to actually publish the risk appetite of your business. So you actually make risk statements public, which will ultimately become a challenge in relation to how far you can honor the promise of those risk statements in the reality of what follows. Because if you promise up front that you will contain your maximum loss to, let's say, 10 million, and you report the following year that you're at 50 million, then somebody's going to be asking the hard questions. So this risk appetite is making a much more explicit statement, and it talks, where Patter talked of earlier, to having the discussion with the board to say, well, you know, we are running a lot of systems here, we have a lot of kit, we have a lot of networks, a lot of apps, and things can go wrong and do go wrong, and we have to position an understanding of that. The other piece to pay regard to is at the bottom there, which I talk about, the tsunami effect. If you consider the pictures that we saw from Japan of that massive wave coming off the Pacific and impacting the island, I see that a little differently from what I believe can happen from cyber activity coming onto your business model. It has ultimately a power of almost total destruction, and I'll talk a little bit more about that subsequently. How you define that is in terms of low probability, high impact events. That is to say, those things that you may decide to yourself, it'll never happen to us, we'll be all right on the night, the usual excuses, but can it ultimately come home to roost? Can we be the subject of a catastrophe? And if we are, have we actually advised the business in advance that there could be a catastrophe? And if so, what nature would that be? Because that feeds back again into this question of developing your risk appetite. Because you've got to look at the business as usual pieces, and you've also got to spend a little bit of time defining what it is that you ultimately have got to say, we cannot protect you against certain things happening. Because that's being honest and upfront. It's being recognizing that there are aspects of cyberspace against which there is no insurance policy, there is no ability to write the cover. and therefore you have to be open to admit that. Now, if I consolidate these three circles, I bring it into this diagram, which what I'm trying to highlight here is, first of all, the world of possibilities. That is to say, there's a likelihood of a risk in that situation, the timing of which is uncertain, because that's the nature of what's out there. The probabilities, which are the narrower definition of that, are those that you would expect to happen to your business. So you're actually saying, we believe it's possible we'll be hit by a DDoS attack, but we don't know when, but nonetheless, we need to prepare against that possibility. And then the damage is to say, yes, but we also need to do an impact assessment on what would happen if it did hit us. Because there will be damage. There could be downtime, loss of productivity, media handling issues, a lot of public focus. And what I'm suggesting here is that the key is in being able to align your risks with the available budget for defence, because we're all stretched and challenged constantly in relation to how much money is available for deployment in affecting IT solutions. Not so long ago, someone came to me with, I think it was 32 separate ideas as to what we needed to do to increase security. My only question to them was, which of those can we not afford to do? Because in a sense, if you know that there's a solution, are you obligated to effect a solution, or are you obligated to pick and choose in a list and simply say, okay, well, we run a risk, we'll take a chance. There's nothing wrong with running risk. Let me be clear on that. There's nothing wrong with running risk. What I'm saying is, if you want to run risks, you need to be explicit in making the business aware of those, because when it goes wrong, they will come back to you and they will say, you didn't tell us, or we weren't aware of the fact that the internet could go down for 12 hours, because the implication of that to the business is quite substantial. Now, what I'm also conscious of is that you know, as we look at the responsibilities that exist, we have equipment which is deployed all over the world in many cases. You have laptops, you have servers, you have mainframes, all sorts of kit, both internal and external, owned by third parties, etc. Your networks are constantly changing. You have delivery taking place to businesses and to customers, so you're in constant contact. And your systems are also in flux all the time. And I know a number of years ago when we sought to introduce a change freeze, we were still managing to make 600 changes a day, even in a change freeze situation. So technology never actually stops. And the point being that as this is all in a moving firmament and is dynamic in itself, the attack still keeps coming at you from varying and different points, because the attack vectors themselves are constantly changing. So the whole thing is very much a model in flux. Now, there's a deeper version of that, and I don't expect you to read that. This is courtesy of the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, recently released, but it talks about things like asset inventories, configuration guidance, vulnerability analysis, threat analysis, intrusion detection, incident management. It hubs together many of the dynamics that are necessarily there that provide for an effective security shield and for making choices and selection in relation to how you actually align both your online presence, your databases, your web servers, your application servers, etc. And if you can't sleep, it certainly makes for good reading. To me, the ultimate nightmare for any business is those 4 words. And don't think it doesn't happen. I mean, I was sitting a couple of weekends ago at home, and I popped onto my email provider, and I got these 4 words. And those 4 words sat and looked at me for the rest of that day. For the whole of Saturday, I was sitting thinking, why am I working with these people? What rubbish is this? What fool was I to think I should trust them? And suddenly the nightmare is there. This is real time happening. And this is operational risk management writ large. This is when the cameras turn up and say, we want to speak to the person in charge. And of course that's your managing director or your head of department or whoever it happens to be, but they will immediately turn to whoever you are and say, hey, what's going on here? Help me. Suddenly I'm aware of an issue I wasn't aware of before. And the tangibility of this keeps increasing. I mean, I quote, for example, Ryanair, which historically used to be a booking company. You would surf on, you would book your flight, and in 6 weeks or a month's time, whatever it was, you'd fly with them. Today, that company uses the World Wide Web presence to print your boarding passes for you. So it becomes an operational tool. Therefore, what is the tolerance for downtime that you can have in a model that is so totally dependent upon being 24/7 non-stop active? And this, in a sense, is the challenge. And when the business asks the question, they want to know who's responsible for any incident that turns up. So the challenge is constantly there to the business, to you to respond to the business. What's at stake in those situations is not one thing but many things, between loss of trust, which is the trust that the customer might have had in you as the business provider, loss of reputation, and we saw that recently in relation to, for example, Sony came under pressure and has been under massive pressure. That equally affects the brand, because there was not only Sony but there was PlayStation within that concept that came under attack. The whole question of the franchise. I can quote you an illustration of a credit card processing company in the United States that failed in its data security, and within a very short space of time that company went completely bust because the people who used that entity lost entirely the confidence in it, switched their business and denied them any franchise value going forward. Clearly loss of business in the sense of if you have downtime, how long will you be down, how long will it take to come back up again, and the issue of market presence, where again your competitors are very quick to move in on this and challenge you in relation to what's happening. So I think the other point that comes from this is the point at the bottom, which is managing incidents themselves is actually critical to ensuring your ability to survive. Paul made reference previously to her RSA, did not manage the incident well. And this comes down not simply to your technical ability to restore, but your actual capacity to manage incidents through. Peter this morning touched upon the matrix, which I have defined as the responsibility matrix, because the point I wanted to make on this is responsibilities for cyber tend to be very disparate and varied. You know, it can be part of the fraud department, part of the IT department, access controls, maybe somewhere else, information security, CISOs. There is an ability and a capacity to spread the responsibility for this broadly and widely. Yet when we look at the dynamics that are at play, what people are looking for generally is for a well-developed business model that has resilience built in, that has a capacity to withstand shock, that is on a regular basis proven and tested through rehearsal exercises. And this is to the degree to which I have the concern that too much of the responsibility for cyber is dissipated and therefore not concentrated sufficiently. Equally, let me talk upon the threat from within. The current economic situation has jeopardized many jobs, continues to mean that the bonus culture and all the stuff that was there before doesn't exist to the same degree. And this has led to disgruntled employees, people who feel that they are not as well cared for and looked after as they used to be. And these people have the capacity to get even with their employer, or in many cases their former employer. And it is apparent that there have been an increase recently in attacks mounted from within or near within the corporation, either those who used to work for it or those who are still working for it. So the ability to have a go within the company is quite critical. Also, the question of can you be hosting inappropriate material? You know, is somebody running a business within your business, and are you aware of that potential? Are you scanning? Are you validating to see if that's taking place? The subject of illegal content. Could you be hosting or have people downloaded paedophilia onto your systems? A criminal offence in itself, a very disclosable one. So again, something which you have to be very conscious of, where individuals can cause difficulties. I talk about the recruited purveyor. What I mean there is about the degree to which the criminals are active in going into the outside world to find employees who can be corrupted, because data is wonderfully valuable at this point in time. Let me give you an illustration of that. Let me give you an illustration of a laptop, which, let's say we go back to the example of the nationwide lost laptop. So a laptop has a commercial value of what, maybe €2,000 for the sake of argument. So the insured value of that laptop is €2,000. That's what's on the company's books. That's what you would get back if you reported the loss to your insurers. What isn't insured is the data. What isn't insured is the intellectual capital. Those are not items that are carried specific to the asset. So let's then say there were 10,000 customer records on your laptop and it goes missing. The street value of those 10,000 records is about €10 a head. So suddenly the value of what's missing goes from 2,000 to 102,000. 10,000 records by €10. The ability for the criminals to then turn that into real money is that they can multiply that number by a factor of at least 10 again. So for 10,000 records, you're now looking at potentially €1 million of a loss plus 2,000 that hangs out from something as simple as a laptop that goes missing with customer records on it. When you think of what Salesforce is run around with, you think of how much data is in move constantly in corporations. It highlights again the criticality of the need for the basics to be got right at an encryption level and generally right across the company. We touched upon briefly earlier the question of the idealistic sympathizer, people who actually support a cause, be it Al-Qaeda or whatever, and they exist, and companies need to protect themselves against them. Equally, the fat-fingered developer, as I describe it, in terms of the individual who just happens to make a few mistakes in producing code or doing development work. Something gets locked into a program, it goes through proving and testing, but it isn't discovered. It then gets launched into the World Wide Web, and suddenly after several weeks it starts to malfunction. And what are you left with? You're left with a major disaster in terms of trying to manage that through. Equally, the concept of the idiot at the helm. If you do have someone at the top who doesn't really understand what they're doing, you can end up with quite a mess because people don't want to challenge them, because it becomes this deification of, oh, well, we don't want to touch, he's a bit loopy, so leave them alone, they'll be all right. Equally, moving on to discuss the danger from without, and this really picks up on this theme of outsourcing and how far third parties are now involved in processing. Wherever you may outsource or on process to, the responsibility still lies with the originating company. No matter what happens, you're still on the line for whatever goes wrong. And whilst SLAs may exist to protect the level of service, they are not the answer in relation to when things go wrong. So my argument here is that you need not only to have the plan A, which is the business as usual model, you also have to plan the plan B, which is the backup. And in many cases, if you are 5 nines dependent in terms of 99.59s, you really do have to have plan C. And if you talk to any of the major service providers that are operating out of this country, the 24/7 operators, your Googles, your Yahoos, whatever, they have to have resilience to such a level that no way can they live at anything less than that 100% service, which means in many cases you do have to have the plan C, proven and tested. And that is the criticality here. Regular proof and testing is critical. Too much of what I see is driven by an ability to accept that, okay, fine, it's a very good and trusted company we're working with. Sure, they're nice people. Everything seems okay. It's a nice centre. It'll be fine on the night. Don't leave them be. We'll believe them. We'll trust them. Don't is a simple answer. You can't. It's not that they're not good people, but you have to have the proof. And you have to have that ability on your books to see that in reality. Dynamic disruption is therefore needed, and that is to say that the program of disruption you have to feed to them is in the nature of making it happen in real time, not in the situation of you advertise 6 weeks in advance that we're going to have a little bit of a system test here, and everything gets scaled back and run accordingly, and then we do it on a Saturday night at midnight and there's very little traffic. You need to test things for volume, you need to test them at full tilt, you need to be able to do that, and you need to get the confidence back that that is doable. And the other critical point here is data. It's not just about operations. Data today is very much where the battlefront is at. The ability to steal data, the ability to corrupt data, the ability to use data is fundamental to where the whole world has moved to, and a lot of what is being fought over out there is the war over data. Scenario planning is one of these things that I think you ask at senior management level, how much scenario planning do you do? And if they can be bothered to do one event a year, it's probably as much as they think they're capable of. To my mind, the real-time example of management is that issue of the television camera turning up and saying, we need to talk to somebody, what's happening here. You don't want to get into that situation. You need to rehearse catastrophic loss. You need to rehearse loss of intellectual capital. You need to go through those pain barriers as a business so that there's a conjunct of interest between the business, between IT, between the risk management, between the audit and compliance functions. Everyone needs to have a shared sense of ownership here and recognize that when the challenge comes, it's an ability to survive, and that ability goes across everybody. So, how much is done in practicing customer downtime? If you consider the need now to actually do rehearsal on a manual basis almost, because so much of the dependency is on technology. If the technology goes, if you have voice over IP, for example, you suddenly don't even have a connected network. So you can't even communicate with people. A lot of the challenges from the operational world come in when business falls over and the call centers get flooded, and suddenly you're into having to manufacture a solution on the spot, on the fly, which is never the way to do it. The issue is to practice it, and that's why the business needs to show interest in downtime. Is IT the only area concerned about cyber attacks? If it is, I would be worried, because if the business doesn't see it as part of their ultimate capacity to prove and test the model, particularly where you've disintermediated so much, if you go on a model that goes straight to market with the web, you really do have to have that resilience absolutely proven and tested, and if not, you need to know why not. Ultimately, cyber has many unique features to it. I think the greatest of those is the fact that, if you go back to my tsunami example, Mother Nature does not advertise in advance that there's going to be an earthquake. It simply happens. In the IT world, shit happens, and you have to expect that shit's going to happen at some stage. It's the art of the unexpected, and it's managing the unexpected. There are discernible patterns in some cases. I know Friday afternoons can be a period of time that can be a problem. I know weekends in advance of holiday weekends can often be a time when things can suddenly go pear-shaped. Yet strangely, when the World Cup was on, I don't know if anyone observed, but the actual amount of cybercrime dived dramatically at that point in time. It was almost like an amazing period of about a month when people seemed to be so totally distracted by other things that crime just seemed to have gone on holidays for that month. It was most unusual. That maybe explains why MasterCard sponsors the World Cup. But the impacts will also come with force. I think that was the comment that came earlier. You know, when you get one torpedo targeted and can attack, maybe it's only a €5 hit, but you can then send hundreds or thousands of these directly after that. And if you can get one good scam going, you really can very quickly clean up a lot of money and make a lot of disruption to a lot of businesses and make a lot of people very miserable as a result. And the consequences can be crippling. The effects of it can definitely bring businesses to their knees. The other point is that in terms of fixing it, you're going to have to fix it if you're going to do this without rehearsal. You have to fix this in real time and in the public gaze, because the cameras are going to be outside the door. You're going to be forced to have to repair, to rectify that non-stop. And again, because the consequences can be fatal. How long can you withstand downtime? You know, have you rehearsed that? I mean, 12 hours, is that going to kill you? 24 hours? Getting difficult now. 36 hours, wow, it's got to be a big story at this stage. By the time you get to 72 hours, I'd say your ability to recover is almost going beyond the limits of possibilities. So in thinking of those senses, how much does the business understand the need to make investment up front to protect that degree of resilience that gives you the capacity to come back up? And that's really the bottom point there, that the business needs to recognize the extent and nature of the cybercrime risks and to provide time and resources to enable you to deliver on an agreed schedule of what's appropriate. Just to conclude then, it has been said before, you've got to know your enemy. You have to have an understanding through doing research, through inter-industry groups, through coming together appropriately and necessarily. Think this through, because the attack from cyber tends to come either sectorally, it can come in a country format, and we've seen that before in the financial industry where they actually attack the country rather than any one player within the country. There's even a concern over the potential, for example, in the .ie, that if there's an attack on .ie as opposed to any other suffix, that that again could be an issue in relation to where Ireland would be under attack as opposed to any other jurisdiction. The whole issue then of tracking the threats, and this is on a dynamic basis. You've got to be accepting of the reality that what's behind all of this attack is constantly moving and will not advertise to you in advance where it's coming from. But we saw from earlier presentations that it is possible to spot the tremors as they test out new means of attack. And if you're clued into that sort of world, then you have an ability to be able to head it off at the pass rather than simply discover that there's a major impact and you're at the root of it. You've got to talk to senior staff, and the comment came previously that it's hard to get into the boardroom with this sort of stuff. I think Padder again talked very much of the importance of taking this story to the boardroom. Many of the boardrooms have been populated heretofore by people whose generation was way offline with technology. They never really understood much beyond pocket calculators. this is changing all the time, and the need, therefore, is to engage intelligently with the boardroom and insist that you get your way in there, because that's the only way to raise the seriousness of the issue. It's the only way to get the allocation of the budget. It's the only way to catch the attention of senior management sufficiently that they want to work with you rather than simply squabble with you over budgets, costs, allocations, and the necessary mapping of risks. And that's where I think the issue of defining the ownership of cybersecurity is still something that I think needs a lot of rethinking, because, again, we haven't had our Pacioli moment in relation to that either. Regular proving and testing and setting objectives for those proofs and tests is vital. You have to know what you're trying to prove and test against. It's not just enough to be doing it as a mechanical exercise. You have to actually be able to do it from a business perspective of how much pain can you withstand, for how long can you withstand it, and who will help to dig you out. Will you have to turn to someone externally? Will you have to work with competitors even? It's been known, and it is known, that in many cases if an institution was in trouble, other institutions would have to draw alongside and help, particularly if it was at a national level. And we've seen the implication of Stuxnet in relation to physical infrastructure and what could happen in that world. So develop your defences, and then review regularly, repetitively and rigorously. People don't like those 3 R's. But I think they are an imperative set of 3 R's. And finally then, I believe there is the importance of getting independent authentication of what you're doing, because the inevitability is if you do it internally without external provocation, you're going to forgive your colleagues their excuses. You're going to give them the out when they should be held to account. Often there's not enough ability to hold to account because you know that you've got to behold to them tomorrow or the day after for something else. You've got to be rigorous in proving and testing, and you've got to ensure that there is that independent authentication. Without that, I think you're probably not setting the bar high enough, and you may not get enough feedback of what other people are seeing still in the outside world that's going to help you to protect and defend your business model. Ultimately, I think the earlier speaker, yeah, we need victory in this. There is a lot of positivity in what goes on. But when you see the stupidity of the word password often being the most used password, when you see the stupidity with which you can hack and crack stuff, even at an elementary level, there's a lot of value is being exposed. And I think going forward, there's a lot of business stands to be embarrassed. And if you look at the trend and what's been happening recently, I do believe that there's a rising tide of attack. I think that that's happening because there's more people with more time. There's more people who are anti-capitalist. There's more people who feel hard done by the current economic situation. And there's pressure on businesses to cut costs. What I know is the criminals are not cutting costs. They're actually investing. And in doing that, the return that they can harvest is a very substantial return, because we know that the actual money that's coming from cybercrime as a return to the criminals is huge. And in that sense, don't think it's going to go away. It's a non-stop battle, and your best defense is attack, but also to ensure that your defense lines are built high enough, strong enough, and able enough to withstand whatever gets thrown at you. I'll rest there. Thank you.